how the work that he's highlighted will affect you and how you can be part of the conversation about teacher value added. We'll start with a little bit of an introduction from Jason, and I have a couple of questions for him, and then if you type your questions into the chat box, I will try to select as many questions as I can in the next hour or so, and try to represent all of the points of view that your questions reflect. I'll say a little bit about my role. I'm a professor here in the School of Education. As you may know, Rossier, as a research school of education, has a wide range of professors that look at both teacher education issues from a learning perspective, from an education psychology perspective, and from a policy perspective. And I'm a professor in K-12 policy, and myself and several other colleagues in the school are involved in the conversation about teacher value added and teacher evaluation and teacher compensation at local level, state level, and federal level. And that's why I was chosen to be the moderator today. The rules here are much like a classroom, so we're going to respect all points of view, and everything we say here we're regarding as off the record, so this is not a public forum. It's within the MAT at USC community. Okay, so with that, let me start by asking Jason to tell us a little bit about how the story and the series of stories came about and why you did it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. These stories started more than a year and a half ago when a colleague of mine was working on a separate series of stories at the newspaper about essentially describing how hard it was for the school district to fire teachers who had been accused of criminal behavior in the classroom, touching kids inappropriately, showing them pornography, things like that, things that most people would agree that teachers should be removed from the classroom. His series just showed how difficult that was, what a lengthy process that was. In the course of doing that, he came across a kind of startling number, which was that in the school district, with the teacher evaluation system they use right now, 99% of teachers were getting a passing grade. So this seemed worth looking into, and I was asked to work with him on a series of stories exploring that issue. And we began really by reading a lot of the research. What we were trying to figure out was who else is doing this better, and what are they doing to evaluate teachers in a way that makes more sense? Because obviously, if 99% of your kids are getting an A in class every year, there's something wrong with your grading system. We looked across California at major school districts and found that basically all school districts in California were using a very similar approach. This kind of very vague and somewhat arcane checklist that principals would go by a teacher's classroom once every year, once every 3 years, once every 5 years, and check off the boxes. And essentially each box was kind of a very broad, somewhat vague category, like, effectively uses different learning, addresses different learning styles. So then we started looking across the country and said, well, who else? Surely other states have figured this out. And we found that most of the country was doing this in a very similar way, that essentially all across the United States, teachers were not being very well evaluated and weren't getting any feedback from their principals and from the system about their performance. We did, in that kind of journey, find that there was this weird thing going on in Tennessee called value added. And essentially a statistician there, a former agronomist, Bill Sanders, had realized in the late 80s that with the standardized test that kids took every year, there would be some way of estimating with statistics what impact different teachers were having. The approach had been used in academia for many years, starting in the 70s with Eric Hanishek, and we started reading the academic literature on what research using this approach found. And it was pretty startling. A lot of the things that we assume as kind of observers of the school system to be true just had no basis in fact. So what we thought of as a good teacher, lots of years of experience, having the right credentials, having good grades in college, all of these things that we assumed made for good teachers turned out to be not predictive at all. And there was this mystery, what made for great teachers. And even the leading experts in the field that we talked to said, we have no idea. We can study it, we can estimate it, we can look at the outcomes of their children and see that some are having huge gains and others are having really very little gains, but we don't know why. And so we said, well, this is worth writing about. And rather than, so we actually wrote a brief article about Bill Sanders, the Tennessee guy who invented this, and a brief attempt to bring this approach to San Diego to talk about the distribution of quality with a superintendent named Terry Greer. That article got no attention whatsoever and was just kind of another education article that runs in the paper. But we already at this point had the idea, this was October of last year, that some of the best research in the field had been done with data from LA Unified, and that our local school district had really this really robust, long span of good data, and that why not use it? The school district has this data and hasn't used it. Why not do this type of analysis here in Los Angeles?
So the interesting basis for this set of articles is really, and I'll speak as a researcher because it reflects the work that I've done, that teachers are the #1 school-related factor that affects student achievement. And research, academic researchers, myself and others have shown, quite convincingly, that the difference in terms of student achievement gains between a bad teacher or a poor teacher and a great teacher is really quite substantial. So up to a full grade level difference in achievement between a teacher in the top 15% versus the teacher in the bottom 15%. So having a teacher who seems to be able to get consistently high student achievement gains can really make a major difference for kids. In fact, again, the research suggests that if you were to get great teachers in front of kids several years in a row, you could close the achievement gap, which is obviously something that we all are really concerned about. So you kind of stumbled across this value-added notion. So then how did you come to get the LA data and do the analysis that you did?
So, having read that research and the kind of startling conclusions from it, we and knowing that it had been released to academics like yourself, we said, well, why not release it to a newspaper? So the first thing we did was went and talked to the superintendent, Ramon Cortines, and we said, look, there's this remarkable research being done with your data. The district hasn't used it. Could we look at it and see what we find? And he said, sure, I'm all for data usage. Let me call my data person and have them give it. Well, it took a lot longer than that. We ended up having a protracted fight with the school district. It started very politely, but it devolved into a fight eventually over what exactly was releasable. And what was different that we were asking for than what most researchers would ask for is we wanted teacher names. We didn't want to know just what the trend line was and what the general pattern was, but we felt that this information was so important and it was so crucial to what was working and not working in specific schools that if the broader research held true in this body of work, that parents would really benefit from knowing that schools may not be that different from each other, but the individual teacher your child is assigned to is hugely important and could really set the trajectory for that child's life academically.
So what do you make of certainly many critics suggest that doing this kind of data analysis is interesting and maybe useful, but you're invading the privacy rights of individuals by getting names associated with the data. What do you think of that argument?
It's an important argument. It's one that we wrestled with internally over the course of a year. Just journalists in the room, editors, our database people, discussing the ethics of this, because we knew that if we went ahead with this, we'd be going kind of beyond our normal role. We hold institutions and individuals accountable all the time. I'm an investigative reporter. That's what I do. But what we're thinking about doing in this case was really publishing a database with scores, imperfect scores, scores that only give a limited window into the performance of public employees who were doing a really important job. So there was this balancing act that we had to have. On one hand, the reasonable expectation of privacy of teachers who say, look, I'm not a public figure. I'm not running for office. I don't have my name in the newspaper on some database with some performance thing. And on the other hand, you had the interest of kids and their parents. At this point, when we had conducted the analysis, we saw that what a lot of the literature was showing was really true, that there were stark differences in the outcomes that different teachers were having. There were patterns that were fascinating to look at and led to important policy conclusions. And that to ignore this actually was a decision we would also have to weigh the ethics of. So ultimately, we decided that once we had this information and saw and tested its reliability, and we spent a lot of time going out into classrooms with this data in hand and talking to principals and parents and students and teachers about, is what this telling us, does it make sense with what everybody else is seeing, and do we feel like this is reliable information? Once we became convinced of that, which we really did, we felt like that the significance of giving this information to families, to parents, and to their students outweighed the reasonable concerns of teachers to have their privacy kept.
So say a little bit about how these measures are calculated, because there's a lot of mystery about, how do you take student standardized test scores, which are imperfect measures of student learning, and make some inferences about teacher effectiveness on the basis of those measures?
I would turn that question back. I mean, I'll give you the lay version, and you tell me if I'm getting it right. Essentially, it's you need a PhD in economics or statistics to understand it at a nuanced level, and I've been working at that for the last year. That's part of what we spent that year doing, which was talking to experts like yourself and your colleague Dan Goldhaber and others across the country, saying, what is this doing, and is there something there? Can we rely on this? Is it reliable enough to use in a high-stakes way? In essence, what it's doing is it's looking at individualized students. So our standard achievement tests, they compare one cohort of students to another cohort of students. And we know the flaws of that, right? These kids may be different from those kids, and you may be picking up those differences, not some actual performance difference. The strength of value added is that it's following individual students year after year and watching their performance gains or losses. And essentially what it tries to do is it tries to mask all of the outside influences on a student. The socioeconomic situation that child grew up in, the learning that happens outside of school, all of these things that teachers can't control for and shouldn't be held responsible for. It's an attempt statistically to control for all those and to isolate out the impact that the teacher has on what the teacher's teaching, on these kind of the core standards that are tested on the standardized test.
Right. So that's exactly the correct intuition. So as with any measure, value-added measures are not perfect, but what they attempt to do is isolate the effect that can reasonably be attributed, in this case, to teachers in terms of their effect on student learning. And in order to do that, you look at an individual student's growth trajectory, normally over several years, and you can, on that basis, you take account of where the student starts from, so all of the things that affect the differences in levels of achievement are to some extent held constant by looking at growth. And then you say, on the basis of that trajectory, what would we have expected that student to have done under that continuing trajectory, and then we can compare it to what actually happened.
Right.
And that difference is the value added, and hopeful. Most cases, we hope the difference is positive so that kids do better than they would have been expected to do, and in some cases they do worse. And this measure of which is not a perfect measure.